now because calls to change the voting system are as much a part of the post-election aftermath as the Prime Ministerial motorcade swooping into Buckingham Palace, or a speech in front of that famous black door. However, this time, should we take it more seriously? Labour have just increased their vote share by around 1.6% on their lowest result since 1935, but increased their number of seats by 211. Whilst the Reform vote share is 14.3%, and that vote has been rewarded by 5 seats. So, is the case for electoral reform now overwhelming? Well, we're joined by the journalist and broadcaster Michael Crick. And Michael, this is perhaps strangely reminiscent of 1983, except precisely in reverse.
I'm just trying to think that one through. 83, you mean a Labour...
How the SDP split the Labour vote. They got 25% apiece, and Margaret Thatcher came through with 400 seats. Yeah, this time around, you've got Reform and the Tories, and Labour coming through with around 400 seats.
Exactly. And indeed, you know, the setting up of the SDP a couple of years before that, in 81, really... dogged Labour throughout the 80s, and it delayed Labour's return to power because there were always a significant number of Labour types who joined the SDP, and eventually they either came back, or some of them, like Danny Finkelstein, went off to the Conservatives. I mean, again and again in our history, we've seen Labour in opposition, but this was true before the war, you know, believing in proportional representation, and then when they get into government, they think, oh, well, we don't need proportional representation again. We've just had an amazing election victory, so let's forget about it. And I think that's what you're going to see now, even though the Labour Party conference, I think on more than one occasion, if I remember rightly, in recent years, has voted for PR. The big unions, which still play something of a role in the party, most of them now believe in PR. The constituencies overwhelmingly, at the last time they were asked, anyway, a year or two ago, believed in PR. So in normal times, the atmosphere should be right, really, to bring it in. But of course, Labour think they've won this resounding victory, which of course they have in terms of seats, but they haven't in terms of the popular vote, as you quite rightly point out. And is this going to get anywhere? I don't know. But what I would say is this, that what's happened to Reform, and I don't support or vote for Reform, as you might expect, but I do think it is a gross injustice. And it's a worse injustice than anything that the Liberal Democrats suffered. I mean, maybe what UKIP suffered in 2015 was even worse, because they got nearly 4 million votes and only 1 MP. Now at least Reform have got 5. So I think I do think.
And yet, Michael, arguably, is this not the system working? The system is designed to give stable majority government. Lots of people wanted to give the Tories a kicking. They weren't quite sure on the Labour Party. Votes split all over the place. But in the end, we've ended with a strong majority government, at least for the next 5 years. Now, this coalition is a weakly compiled coalition that could completely collapse. This could be a one-term government with a massive majority. But surely that's the system working. The country wanted to get rid of the Tories, and they have.
Well, they may have wanted to get rid of the Tories, but the country couldn't agree as to who should replace the Tories. Should it be Labour or Reform or the Lib Dems or the Greens or one of the nationalist parties?
Surely it's better to have a majority government than a sort of mess of a hung parliament where we spend the next 12 months horse trading.
Not on this scale. And the danger is actually on the other side, the what's happened to Reform side of the argument. Because if Reform, at subsequent elections, carry on getting huge votes and they go above 4 million, 5, 6, 7, and they still don't get very many MPs, I think a lot of Reform supporters are going to lose faith in the democratic system. And I think that this, we at least have to start thinking about this. And another thing, I think, and which the government could remedy right now, this evening, if they wanted to, is appointments to the House of Lords. There's been a sort of ban on any party led by Nigel Farage having people appointed to the House of Lords. That's another injustice, and I've said so before. And they could remedy that tonight, because it's if a party has got that 14% of the vote, they should have a decent number of peers, and all they've got in the Lords are people who happen to be there in the first place and defected. The Lords, I think it's a ridiculous institution. Nonetheless, it is part of our legislature, and we should do something about it. I mean, there are other problems we've got coming up the road as well. The low turnout, which is only going to be made worse, I think, by bringing the voting age down, to which this government this party anyway, is committed. I think it's bonkers, frankly, because turnout is at its lowest. You may not agree with me as a young man, but turnout is at its lowest amongst the youngest voters. And if you take the voting age down to 16, it's likely to depress turnout even more.
Yeah, no, I might look young, but I can promise you I am older than 16. This does not
I think I'd realise that.
affect me. No, I actually once ran a campaign at university many years ago to lower the voting age to 12. It was a satirical campaign because I was sort of saying that, well, if you're age 16, you're not allowed to drive, you're not allowed to fight for your country, you're not allowed to drink alcohol, you're not allowed to smoke, but you're not allowed to do any of those things at 12 either, so why not? Anyway, we're getting slightly distracted. It does seem like it's a peculiar thing that we've got different ages for different rights and responsibilities. But you've been following some of these candidates of the Labour Party as well. And just before we go, I do want to get your take on what the next House of Commons looks like, because there'll be a lot of new faces that are very unknown to the general public.
Yeah. Well, I mean, if you look at overwhelmingly the new people are Labour, of course. And if you look at them, there's a lot of people who've got really boring titles like communications consultant or public affairs consultant, the sort of jobs that, you sort of think, well, what they sort of, anyway, whatever. There's far too many of them. But there are a lot of clearly very talented people in the Labour ranks and the sort of people who you don't normally think of as Labour MPs, businessmen who've made a lot of money, people who've spent time in the armed forces. There's at least a dozen of those, people who've and people have, there's a classicist who, is from King's College who's been teaching classics in a private school. Again, you wouldn't have expected that in the past from the Labour Party. My favourite is a new guy called Brian Leishman. Yeah, I think he's going to be quite a character, this guy. He's from Brian Leishman. He's on the Labour left, which is extremely rare. And he is a professional golfer. In the sense that he's, done he's PGA accredited, and he's the professional golfer at Alloa Golf Club. In other words, he runs the shop and he, teaches people how to play better golf. I don't think there's ever been a professional golfer in Parliament ever before. And my other favourite, not Labour, is a Liberal Democrat called Ros Savage, who's the new MP for South Cotswold. Again, a sports person. And she has rowed solo, single-handedly across the world's three biggest oceans, the Pacific, the Atlantic, and the Indian Ocean. She's the first person ever the only woman ever to have done that, and she's in the Guinness Book of Records for having done so.
These members of Parliament are a sketch writer's dream. We're going to be reading about all sorts of rowing and golfing metaphors and how people have sort of...
Endless numbers who've been in bands of various kinds. One or two of them didn't get elected, actually, like Tom Gray in Brighton Pavilion, who looked like being a real loose cannon because he described the royal family as parasites only in 2020. I'm amazed he got through the Labour vetting process. But the Labour vetting process
I look forward to meeting and greeting a host of new characters.